So this has been, first of all, I do want to thank the organizers of this event. It's a lot of work to put this together, but I think there'll be a lot of fruit for eternity and for the rest of our lives. There's just so many people influenced by even just one thing that you take home from this event. I'm excited to give this presentation. The issue was there is so much to talk about, the scope and the detail here, that to compress it down into just 55 minutes or 1 hour is, it took a lot of work. So the way I've decided to do it is I've structured this to be a self-contained standalone seminar so that if nothing else that you don't dive into it any further, you can still go home with a seminar that's a standalone thing. It doesn't depend on a number of other things. However, there's certain details that I'll cover that really do need to be expanded upon if you're going to be interacting with other people. So from time to time, you're going to see references in the presentation here. And at the end, I'm going to put up a QR code and a link that you can download a PDF that contain all the slides that you're going to see here. So I would recommend you don't take notes. You just sit back and soak it up, because if you're taking notes, you're going to miss the next thing. And I'm going to be motoring. And the other thing is that at the end of that handout, you're going to have live links to these references. And these references are the articles I've written that really expand on certain points that would be very helpful to have a deeper knowledge about. So with that in mind, let's begin and look at this, what we're going to just cover this morning, and try and tone down all the coffee I drank before I got here. So just by way of preview, we're going to start with some definitions so that we're on the same page when I'm using phrases and words, so you know what I mean when I'm talking about those things. And then I want to look at the water-to-wine miracle. There are some very implications. The creator of the universe attended that wedding, and he did something, and there's implications for what he did there. So we're going to just pause there because of its relevance to this topic. Then the main section here, I want to look at modern science in Genesis 1 to 3, specific certain areas, certain major events in Genesis 1 to 3, and then take a look at modern science and logic to see what's going on there. And then I want to close the last major part of the section with a cautionary note about how confident you might be in your own personal infallibility when it comes to Genesis chapter 1, and a cautionary note on how much faith you need to be putting in modern science. As a scientist, I happen to know, and we're going to cover this, that the real state of modern science and what people perceive it as two very different things. And so I want to look at that and then some takeaways. So let's begin with some definitions first of all. I want to start off with something that you use every day, but you might have not heard the word. It's axioms. And axioms are fundamental principles. And these fundamental principles cannot be derived from something even more basic. That's one of the characteristics of an axiom. It's a fundamental principle. And these form the necessary basis for reason, for logic, for mathematics. They enable the laws of nature or physics to govern space-time, matter, and energy. They are even more fundamental than the laws of nature themselves. Maybe. It depends where the laws of nature come from. I got my own suspicions there. But they are real. They are very real, but they are not affected by anything physical, not affected by mass, gravitational fields, temperatures on the surface of the sun, whatever. These fundamental principles govern and control material reality. Very important to note this. They are the foundation upon which we build logic with mathematics. They're a foundation for nature, and that's why I have that little diagram. And they're a foundation for morality as well, the axioms. They are real, and they are proof that there is an immaterial reality out there. This isn't, we'll come back to this shortly. They are pre-programmed into the human mind from infancy. And here's an example, the law of non-contradiction. X cannot both be true and false at the same time. And that's the foundation for the principle of falsification in the scientific method. That also controls physical reality. We see it in nature. So that even if there were no humans around, these axioms are not something we invented in our heads. Even if there were no humans around, the axioms would still govern how space-time, matter, and energy interacts with each other. They enable the laws of nature to actually control or govern physical reality. And personally, my own view is that they are attributes of God, the axioms. And you see that when he says he hates a lie. And when God hates a lie, what he's actually saying is that the law of non-contradiction is inherent to the nature of God himself. And so we describe it as the law of non-contradiction, but I would suggest it as an actual attribute of God. He is the origin of the axioms. The causal principle is another axiom. Every effect and every logical conclusion is a result of prior conditions or necessary premises. So even a little child, I did experiments, ethical experiments on my own children, and I tested this out. What happens if I violate the law of non-contradiction with this child? There's something, he sees this, and I say something totally contradictory. Most common response was a momentary look of, and then, Dad, or no. And I never taught the law of non-contradiction to my children. They just intuitively know these things. And this research has shown that even little children have these axioms already pre-programmed into their mind. Now, let's talk about falsification. Falsification is very important in science. If you have a hypothesis or a theory and there's no way to falsify that, and test it and falsify it, then there's been some good papers out recently, which there's some references later on you can look at, that says that's not really science. We're just talking about science fiction here, or philosophy of science, but it has to be testable and falsifiable, but based on the law of non-contradiction. So, this is a very important point to grasp. No matter how much evidence you have to support an idea, and you can find just about any idea at all. I know some people who are heavy into conspiracy theories, and they will always provide some evidence for that. And when you look at that evidence, you could say, okay, that's evidence. That would more or less sort of support this, but what about this over here? And that's where falsification becomes key. For example, one person tried to argue that the center of the earth is actually hollow. It's a hollow sphere, and it's got a lot of dinosaurs, and the CIA is covering this up, and so forth. So, and then presented some evidence that was, to me, a little bit on the weak side of things, but I had also taken a course in fields and what happens for hollow spheres if it's their gravity and so forth, and bottom line is the earth would collapse. So here's another example. Let's say your GPS provides evidence, and mine has, I've been the victim of this sometimes, provides evidence, as you can see with your own eyes, there's the map, there's the route, but as you go on this road or you check it out, you find that you run into this issue here where there's a canyon with no bridge. That one observation, no matter how much evidence you had to believe that's a route you could drive your car to whatever city, no matter how much evidence you had, that one observation that falsifies this should overturn your belief that this is a proper route to take to the city, and if it doesn't, well, you're going to need a new car to say the least. Maybe see the hospital for a while. But the scientific naturalism is another major important concept. It's the belief, and I've circled belief on purpose here, it's the belief that nature is all that exists. It's not something that arises out of science. There's nothing in science that entails scientific naturalism. But I talked to a lot of scientists who hold this belief. It's a philosophical position. And that means that science is the only path to knowledge. You'll see that quite often being said here and there. It also means that nothing supernatural can possibly exist. Everything has to be material, space-time, matter, and energy. And it must deny free will, even as they use it to design their experiments. And I have a paper or an article that's nearing completion I'm going to publish on my website soon. What should science's default position be on free will? And I'm arguing in that the obvious default position for science is that free will exists. And I have the reasons outlined in there. But they have to deny that real free will exists for reasons that we can talk about later. It's also forced to create fictional narratives to explain away God's creative work. And in those cases, you might find there is no compatibility between what God has done in this world and the fictional narratives that science may come up with. And keep in mind, I'm saying this as a scientist. Okay, not everything you hear from the mouth of a scientist is the gospel truth. Let's just put it that way. But, and this is very important, so that's a belief, that belief is falsified by the existence of the immaterial axioms. It's something that scientists use all the time, every day, without realizing that they're actually acknowledging the existence of a reality out here that is more fundamental than space, time, matter, and energy. And the mere fact that those things exist, those immaterial axioms exist, falsifies scientific naturalism. You're going to have a lot of stuff to think about, and some of this that's why we got a handout and slides, and you can meditate on these over the next few weeks. Briefly, a little bit about the myth of science as a gold standard. In theory, experimental science should be highly trustworthy. The reality is, and this is a quote from the journal Nature, which is probably the most prestigious science journal in the world. If you can get a paper published in Nature, it's kind of like winning the gold medal at the Olympics. It's a major event in your academic career. But they've got a number of articles out about this now, and here's the quote. In the competitive crucible of modern science, various perverse incentives conspire to undermine the scientific method, leading to a literature littered with unreliable findings. Failure to replicate published findings is the norm. Note that phrase, the norm. That means it's more likely than not. It's extremely common. It's extremely common that when you look at a peer-reviewed paper from a science journal, especially in certain disciplines, it's much more probable that there's something gone wrong with that. They've massaged the stats. They've been a little bit. They've pre-selected the control groups to bias the outcome. There's been some major discoveries at a major university here in Ontario, which I'll avoid mentioning. And a whole department of cancer research was shut down because of what was discovered going on there. But cancer research is one of the main ones. Anywhere where there's competition for funding, follow the money, there will be human nature intervening. And all you have to do is say, where's the major funding? You better do your homework before referring to those papers. Doesn't mean that they're all false, by the way. Now, I have written an article on that. This will be your first reference, which will be on your downloadable handout, on this issue. And I've got, I don't know, at least 40 references just documenting this issue in science. This is experimental science, which has the highest degree of accountability. Because in theory, people should be able to reproduce whatever you did in your paper and get the same results. And that's the issue, that you don't get those results. The latest one here is just last month. Shocking study exposed widespread math research fraud. Okay, takeaway. Corruption of experimental science, where others can actually check your experiment to see if it can be reproduced, is, quote, the norm. It is far worse in areas of modern science that cannot be reproduced. For example, the past history of the universe, the origin and diversity of life, where the accountability standard really drops because simply we can't rerun the experiment, so to speak. But, and this is a big but, do not write off science. If you're going into the sciences, wonderful. I love science, and I've been interested in that since I was a preschooler, believe it or not. But try to redeem it, and I put the word redeem in there on purpose. Try to redeem it from the corruption it suffers at the hands of human nature. For those going into the sciences, commit yourself to sticking to the scientific method, the experimental method, experimental science, and integrity in how you handle the data and set up your control groups and so forth. So for the papers that I've published, I put, along with that, online, I'll put my software that I wrote, I put test things they can run. They should be able to get the exact same results. My software is there for the world to examine. So I've just defined some terms and talked about a few things. Let's move into the miracle of the water to wine and its implications. So, C.S. Lewis suggested that Jesus had a purpose behind the specific categories or types of miracles that he performed. He wasn't just randomly doing miracles, but he did them with an intention and a purpose. He was sending a message to humanity, not just healing somebody, not just turning water into wine, not just feeding 5,000 people from 2 fish and 5 loaves. He was sending a message. Keep in mind also who Jesus is. It is said in the scriptures that he is the creator of everything that has been created. And apart from him, nothing has been created that has been created. He is the creator of the cosmos. And here he is at a wedding. So let's see what happens. This is a very different one. Most of his miracles were healing. healing type miracles, but this is in a different category here. So the problem was basically Jesus converted or changed 500 liters of water into wine, and it probably didn't take much more than a few nanoseconds. It might have been instantaneous. I don't know. Nobody was there with a stopwatch. But there's some problems in doing that from a scientific perspective. First of all, wine needs carbon in order to form the required organic compounds, and there's no carbon in water. Water is H2O, hydrogen and oxygen. There's no carbon there, so you got to come up with some carbon fairly quickly. And also, good wine requires at least a year. Depending on the type of wine, it might be 3 to 5 years. But it requires at least a year to form the complex carbon compounds that change it from just new wine to good wine. So it requires at least a year, and if samples of that wine were sent to a dozen labs, the clear consensus of science would be that the wine was at least a year old, and it was definitely not formed just from water, but they would be dead wrong, and the biblical account would not be compatible with whatever the lab reports came back from science. So there's just that little cautionary note here that it's not absolutely required that the Bible conform to science, especially if science itself has a corruption problem of human nature. But so you have to navigate yourself through science. And if any of you are going into graduate studies, there's a couple of things you should know about vetting the papers you're going to base your research on. Food for thought. The person who performed this miracle at Cana of Galilee is the creator of the universe and holds the physical creation together. As the years have gone by, first year physics, one of my first degree was an undergraduate degree in physics, and the very first year of that degree, one of the professors was cluing us in about the laws of physics. He says, we have no idea what the laws of physics are. We don't know where they are, what they are. All we can do is we can describe their effect on space-time, matter, and energy, and we describe them in the form of mathematical equations. But what is it that is exercising this control over space-time, matter, and energy? He says, we don't know. And I sat there as a first-year student and thought, wow, this is fascinating. Never thought about that before, but he's right. My personal suspicion is that it is God. It is Jesus Christ. It actually says that. He holds all things together by the word of his power. So the laws of physics themselves are immaterial. They control the material world, but they are immaterial themselves. But that has implications for the universe and for life if God was involved in the creation of those things as he was involved in the wine in Cana of Galilee. So I just throw that out there. See, I'm not proving anything here, but I'm suggesting here's some things that are useful to think about and mull over. And in my mind, I have a figurative stove, and I have the front burners, I have the back burners. There's been pots simmering on the back burner for decades. I throw stuff in those pots because I don't know what to make of them, and eventually things simmer and pop out, or I notice things. And so a lot of this seminar this morning is to throw things into that pot simmering on the back burner of your mind. So now let's look at the main section here. Key question to answer, Genesis 1 to 3, what has modern scientists told us about the following things? Number one, what has it told us about the explosion of space-time, matter, and energy out of absolutely nothing at all? So often I would talk with students at some university somewhere, and they would say, oh, I'm an atheist. And I'd say, what is your explanation for the explosion of space-time, matter, and energy out of absolutely nothing at all? And I just want to hear what they say. It wasn't a gotcha question. I want to hear what they have to say. I want to see how far they've thought about this. And most would have nothing to say. Now, some would appeal more recently to a theory put forward by Lawrence Krauss. We'll come to that shortly. So, first of all, the explosion of space-time, matter, and energy. Secondly, the evidence that the universe has been designed for life. What does science have to say about that? What about the origin of life? Because God seems to have been involved in the origin of life and also in the diversity of life. So what has science told us about that? And then finally, the scriptures in Genesis 1 to 3 talk about something that we later on describe as the fall of Adam, the fall of humanity, the fall of nature itself. What does science say about that? But before I do that, I want to talk briefly about something called the God of the Gaps argument. And again, reference number 2 you're going to see up there. I've written an article on this. I think it's very important to at least read that article because I find that I'm getting ahead of myself. The God of the Gaps argument begins with an absence of information and leaps to the conclusion that God did it. So I don't know what did that. My Gore-Tex bib overalls disappeared several years ago. I have searched high and low. I cannot find those things, therefore God did it. Well, there might be another explanation, and that's the weak point on the God of the Gaps argument. Now, it might be the case that if God has intervened in past history and did something creatively in this world, that in fact science won't be able to find an explanation, and it's not a false conclusion necessarily. It could be true. In fact, you would predict that there may be some things that science will never be able to adequately explain, and it's because God did it. But the weak part of that is that sometimes science does explain things, like say a lightning bolt frying a tree as you're hiking down the trail back in ancient Greece. They might think the gods did that, but then later on we figure out, oh no, it's actually electrical field between the cloud and the ground and so forth, building it. So a good argument begins with known information and then logically infers that there's an intelligent mind behind nature. So a good argument for the existence of God begins with premises that are based on something we know or based on something that's logically true. So we're reasoning from knowledge to the conclusion. We're not reasoning from ignorance to a conclusion. So I always recommend that you try and construct your arguments so that they reason from knowledge rather than, well, we have no idea, science has no idea, therefore God did it. It might actually be a sign, an indicator that maybe there is some divine intervention here, but not necessarily that case. And the frequent mistake that skeptics make is that they conclude all arguments for the existence of God are God of the Gaps arguments. It's kind of frustrating because they obviously are demonstrating their lack of knowledge as to what a God of the Gaps argument is. And this is where it's handy to just refer yourself and perhaps them to this article on what is a God of the Gaps argument. And I know that there's been atheists read that article, and that it's a handy form of hostile peer review to publish stuff online and then look at the comments and then, okay, that good point there, or respond here and then tweak. Hostile peer review is a very valuable thing. Key points, perspective. If an event actually required a divine creation event, we should or may, I don't want to be too strong here, we should predict that any scientific narrative constructed to explain that event might encounter, and that's might, not necessarily, but it might encounter scientific observations that do not fit the narrative. Secondly, we should anticipate the discovery of maybe positive evidence, or perhaps what I might call the fingerprints of an unquantifiably intelligent creator. So that's a perspective to keep in mind. I'm not proving these things, I'm just saying these are things you would expect, or that might be highly possible, or that are plausible to expect. So now let's actually look at those items that Genesis chapters 1 to 3 talked about and see what modern science has to say about it. And first of all, the explosion of space-time, matter, and energy is absolutely nothing at all. And I use the term absolutely nothing at all here on purpose. Now, one of the things we know with certainty now, and it's not actually from science, it's actually from properties of infinite set theory, coupled with real time, which has to elapse one event at a time. And there's reference number 3 up here. So if you're going to say stuff like this, be prepared to back it up. You don't have to necessarily understand it. You say, I read this interesting article that argues that we can know with certainty that time itself, nature itself, had a beginning to its existence, and you refer them to reference number 3, which will be in that downloadable handout. So Lawrence Krauss's so-called universe from nothing, there's been some criticism of that in the peer-reviewed secular scientific literature, and the primary criticism is, wait a sec here. We have an untestable theory that itself is based on something that has not yet been tested. So you're out on a limb, and then there's a limb at the end of that limb that you're out on, and this is where its theory is. But that's not science. And again, reference number 4 is what I would refer you to. I've written an article on this. And these articles often will include references from the secular peer-reviewed world, because at some point it's good to have those things handy. So a lot of these references go to articles where I explain what these things are, but then I back that up if there's going to be some controversy here with references from the secular or academic world. One of the major problems in his thing, it's not really absolutely nothing at all. It does require some form of time. He would not call it time. I might call it a dynamic variable. That's just a fancy way of saying there's a dimension here where things can happen and changes can take place. We're talking time here as Dr. Price's, not Dr. Price, theoretical physicist, what's his name? University of Alberta. Anyways, I won't take the time to work my way through the folders of my mind and find that name for you. But he has pointed out that a dynamic variable will not work. When Lawrence Krauss says nothing, as in the form that he's talking about, he says that thing he's calling nothing is actually unstable. You cannot have instability without a dynamic variable, without the possibility of change. The variable time is in every single equation of physics that we have. It might not appear as t, it might appear as something else like E equals mc squared. Time is in there in the form of c squared is the square of the speed of light, and that is a velocity, and then you got time again. So this is the first point, is that there was a beginning to nature. And I think there's a general consensus in the scientific community that there was a beginning. We even have scientific evidence for that. But I prefer what infinite set theory entails, because you can take that to the bank. The science might discover new things, so it's a good basis for saying we had a beginning. The universe is expanding, work backwards, it converges to a point at some point in the past. But math kind of puts the nail in the coffin of an infinitely old universe. With that in mind, let's work our way through this three-premise logical argument, and we're again going to sneak the axioms in here, which every logician does and every scientist does, but without even realizing it. Premise number one, the cause of nature must be either natural or not natural. And that's a true dichotomy. What that means is it covers all the bases. There's nothing other than these are the two choices you have. It's either natural or it's not natural. And we have a word I'm going to use to represent the not natural set of things. I'm going to call that supernatural. So I've kind of defined what I mean by supernatural. It means it's not composed of space, time, matter, and energy, and it's not governed by the laws of physics. So it's either natural or not natural. And so because it's a true dichotomy, it's necessarily true. No issues so far. Next premise. Just as it is logically impossible for a woman to give birth to herself, so it is logically impossible for nature to have brought itself into existence. And the reason for that, if you dig down in there, is because we have to avoid it's an issue with the law of non-contradiction. For nature to bring itself into existence, or for a woman to give birth to herself, in some way she would have to exist before she existed, so that she would be in a position to give birth to herself and bring herself into existence. That is a logical contradiction, and the same goes for nature bringing itself into existence. We have to avoid violating the law of non-contradiction. So premise number two is necessarily true. And necessarily true in philosophy means there's no way out. It's checkmate. That has to be true. It's necessarily true, assuming the law of non-contradiction. Therefore, the cause of nature is not natural. It has to be supernatural. And the main idea here is when you only have two options, and one of those options is logically impossible, then the other option, no matter how much you might squirm and disagree with it, has to be true. That's paraphrase from Sherlock Holmes. Okay, but that raises another question. Well, then what caused the cause? And I know that this is raised as the killing blow, so to speak, in people's minds. Richard Dawkins does that. Well, first of all, I want to point out that the moment you ask that question, you've implied that the first argument is true. Okay, so you've actually fallen back. Okay, then, let's grant that, but then what caused the cause? And that is actually a very simple response, and it's as close as the watch on your wrist. It's what caused time, because time is one of the components of nature, space, time, matter. So what caused time? So here's another argument, a logical argument, syllogism. Number one, the cause of time, whatever brought that into existence, must either be dependent on time or it has to be timeless. That's, again, another true dichotomy. There's not a third option there, nor is there a continuum between the two. Premise number two, very similar to the first argument we just saw. It's logically impossible for something that depends upon time for its existence to itself bring time into existence. That would be a violation of the law of non-contradiction. And so it follows from that, therefore, the cause of time must necessarily be timeless and eternal, that is, independent of time. Its existence, it doesn't have to stay independent of time, but its existence must be independent of time. In other words, it exists timelessly and eternally, and there's no temporal beginning in front of which to put yet another cause. All the causal chains of this world, both logic causal chains and historical causal chains and natural, they all converge here. This is the end. This is the beginning or the end of all causal chains. And I think it's fascinating that thousands of years ago, we have recorded that God says his name is I Am. That is absolutely fascinating. I was just having lunch with an atheist 2 weeks ago, and he also finds it fascinating. Like, he just considers these ancient nomads and whatever, and then this God appears, and he says his name is I Am, and that one fact alone, this I Am, and even though if he disagrees exactly when the Bible was written or whatever, even if it's a complete fabrication of fairy tales, he says he can't dismiss the brilliance of coming up with a name like I Am. Like, he said, the philosophical implications, the guy's a genius. The philosophical implications are just amazing, and okay, so that's A. Science has no explanation for the origin of nature. In fact, it can't have, because science works with the laws of nature and nature itself, space, time, matter, and energy. But with what caused nature to come into existence has to be not natural, and so you're immediately outside of the realm of science. It's like trying to compose music with a sledgehammer. Actually, you might be able to, let's use something else. It's kind of like being an adjudicator at an orchestra, and the only tool you're handed is a strip of barbed wire. That's it. It's totally the wrong tool. Totally the wrong tool to analyze music. Science is totally the wrong tool to analyze whatever it was that caused, but there's one thing that exists prior to science, it's the axioms. And the axioms permit us to do logical inferences. And just using those axioms, what I showed you here, what you saw, is logic entails, it demands, it requires that there is a supernatural or non-natural cause for nature. And that cause of time itself must be timeless and independent of time in order to be able to bring it into existence. Now let's move into B, the evidence the universe was designed for life. The universe appears to be designed with an incredible degree of fine-tuning for the purpose of supporting life. The probability that any universe at all can support life, according to Sir Roger Penrose, a colleague of Stephen Hawking, is 1 chance in 10 to the 10 to the 123rd power. I can't even describe how small that number is. If you see that number anywhere else in science, we'll put a 0 right there. There is 0 chance that you would ever get a universe. So if you got, this isn't just this universe, it's any kind of universe at all capable of supporting life. So you put all the possible universes, and there's ways science can do that by looking at delta values within the fine structure constants of things. You put all the universes capable of supporting life in this pile, and then the rest over here. This pile over here would be so huge, and this pile is so small in comparison, you got 1 chance of that number winding up with the universe capable of supporting life. So it looks like, suspiciously alike, that it's been designed for the purpose of supporting life. But those who have pledged their beliefs to scientific naturalism cannot accept that. So what has been done is to propose an infinite number of universes. An interesting article, of course, there's another reference, number 7, about where this concept of the multiverse came through, and it was originated because we had to explain the incredible fine-tuning of the universe, and you don't want to appeal to the obvious, which is that there's a mind behind the universe that has an intention that this universe support life, and therefore it's constructed and designed so that it can do so. That is not compatible with scientific naturalism. So the other option is when you have astonishingly small probabilities like that, you need a lot of trials to pull it off. And so that's where the multiverse was initiated and introduced in the area of science. But even that has now been severely criticized because we can't test the multiverse. And again, there's references in that reference numbers. Reference number 7 is my article, but in that I put references to the secular literature. And so it says that the bottom line is that we should be looking at that as more as science fiction. You can write science fiction with words, but you can also use mathematics to write science fiction. That's a big revelation right there. That just because you can describe something mathematically or in English words or in any other human language does not mean it's true. There's a difference between fiction and reality, and that's another whole interesting thing we get off in. But at this point, I want to appeal to Occam's razor. And Occam's razor is just this principle that when choosing between multiple explanations, the simplest explanation that fully explains the problem is to be preferred. Doesn't mean it's right, but it's the preferable one. That's the rational way to go. Don't choose some horrendously complex explanation when a simple one will do. So scientific naturalism, in an attempt to deny the existence of a supernatural cause and creator, appeals to an imaginary, infinite number of unseen, untestable universes, which is the opposite of Occam's razor. So the most rational position for science to follow is to follow the evidence that there is an intelligent mind behind the universe that had an intention, a purpose for the universe, and designed it that way. What about the origin of life? So in Genesis 1-3, God indicates that he was the one who created life, originated it, and in its diversity. So let's take a brief look at that. Science is increasingly admitting that this is almost an impossible task. It is. The more science advances in our knowledge of genetics and on what the minimal life form might look like, the more advances it makes, the gap doesn't close, but in fact it gets bigger and bigger to the point now where science has largely separated that question from, say, Darwinian evolution. The origin of life is a separate problem, but there's an internationally respected evolutionary biologist by the name of Eugene Koonin. Famous name in the evolutionary biology world. And he's written an interesting paper on this. He has proposed that the solution is that there's an infinite number of universes. And in fact, he just looks at, for those of you who know a little bit of biology, he just looks at the problem of RNA replication, which is just a subcomponent of the first life form. Just the probability of getting RNA replication is so small, he does some number crunching. He says, this will never happen in the history of the universe. Obviously, we're going to need a lot of universes, and we're to get lucky, and this is it. It's interesting to read the reviewers' comments because they're actually a little squirming at this point. They say, normally this is the opposite of what we do in science. We don't appeal to an infinite number of things. And they point that out. But Eugene Koonin intentionally states in his closing sentences that the object here is to avoid intelligent design. He actually states that in the closing sentence. And again, I refer you to reference number 7 where I discuss this. Of course, once again, I'd appeal to Occam's razor to infinite number of unseen entities or one unseen entity. And I think there are fingerprints of the one unseen entity. There are we'll come to that shortly. Okay, one of the things to look at is what are called lack of data words. These are words used to gloss over or skate around the absence of scientific data to support a scientific belief. And I put scientific in scare quotes because it's not scientific if it's just a belief and doesn't have any data to support it. So here's one article, and you see this all the time. Once you begin to see lack of data words, you can't unsee them. You start just seeing them everywhere. And I learned the hard way. I was the first major paper I was submitting to a journal. My PhD supervisor was looking it over. And at the end of a paper, it's always tempting to wax eloquent on what amazing things this research might be good for in the end. And I use the word, this suggests, and ta-da-ta-da. And the supervisor says, suggest. He says, do you have some data to back that up? I said, well, no, but I mean, you could infer this. He says, take it out. We don't do that here in biophysics. I said, well, but I read a lot of papers. And then the lights came on. Wait a sec, I like this. I like the rigor involved in not using lack of data words, which are rampant when it comes to origin of life research. So I just looked there. You can see for yourself. I don't even list them all. 28, if you just use one, that's bad enough. That really opens the doors to what you might be able to conclude at the end of your paper. But 28 different ones, my favorite here, because this is really, it's like the ultimate get out of jail free card, is conceivable. That's amazing. Like if you can, if you're allowed to use that in a scientific paper, you can arrive at virtually any conclusion at all. But I would recommend you develop the ability to look for a lack of data words. So let's look at the diversification of life. Variation within a population is observed and is often defined as evolution. So when I took a genetics course at the University of Waterloo, there was a definition of evolution. It's just a variation within a population over time. Specifically with different types of genes. But it's a variation in a population over time, and that's true. You observe that all the time. So if you're going to define evolution that way, then it is true and observable. And so be very cautious about criticizing evolution when you're not even clear on how the term is being used, because you can end up looking like you don't know what you're talking about. Because if evolution is defined this way, then that's necessarily true. Not necessarily, but it's just objectively true for our observation. If you're going to define it as variation, even though it's variation within an existing species, it's still variation. And furthermore, selected aspects of the fossil record and phylogenetic trees will often can allow you, or it can be interpreted as evidence for common descent. And I think, in any kind of a discussion in science, it's good to be able to say, well, yeah, that does qualify as evidence. Let's be honest here, that I can see that as evidence. But what about the test of key predictions, and are they falsified or not? That's the important issue in science. So I want to look at two key aspects of diversification of life. And keep in mind, I don't know how God did it, okay? So often when I was speaking at a university campus, especially if it was in a formal debate, I would say, in this debate, I'm prepared to grant you any way you'd like as to how life came about, including, usually my opponent was some form of a Darwinian evolution. But what I will argue is that there had to be an intelligence behind that method. That's what I'm going to show. And therefore, I define that's my objective, to show there's an intelligent origin here. The fingerprints of the mind are all over this thing. And it doesn't really matter how that came about as a secondary thing. I would say, for the sake of let's move ahead in this debate. So a key prediction of common descent is that there must be no biological limits to variation. So we observe variation occurs, but when you look at a simple life form, let's say M. genitalium is one of the simplest life forms on the planet, and then you look at everything else, you say, well, obviously, if it's all had to descend from something like that over there, there must be enormous possibilities for this variation to occur. It doesn't necessarily have to occur in every single route you might take, but there has to be an awful lot of routes wide open. The problem is that we can greatly speed up this kind of evolution, this kind of variation through a process, and we can do it by many orders of magnitude, because we're not sitting around waiting for fortuitous events. So universities all over the world practice selective breeding, but in every single case over the past 100 and some odd years, including the Lenski long-term evolutionary experiment, you always hit a wall beyond which it's just not going to go any further. And now as science advances, we're beginning to understand why that wall is there, and it's basically you're hitting the wall as to how much variation the information encoded in the genome of that organism permits. And essentially that can boil down even more specifically to you're hitting a wall in the number of proteins that you have available to build organisms. And if you want to go further, you're going to have to encode novel protein coding genes. Now, encoding a protein coding gene is trivially easy as long as it doesn't have to form a stable three-dimensional structure and a function. That's fascinating, but that would be a more technical talk. So, this is falsification number one. It's not hard falsification, but it's indicating that maybe this prediction, so far as we've been able to test it, is constantly and consistently falsified. Is that we always hit a wall in our variation, in our selective breeding experiments in agriculture and plant science. Another key prediction of common descent is that genetic information that's digitally encoded in DNA must on average be increasing. And so you start with something really simple, maybe some simple life form that has information encoding maybe 280 protein coding genes. And you're going to need more than just protein coding genes. You need some sort of information that turns them on and off, gene regulation, so you can actually build an organism. But then you look at all the life forms on the planet today, and let's say we're not the most complex ones, by the way, humans, but we have maybe 18, 20,000 genes that we're aware of. So you got to go from 200 and you got to go from one or nothing and up to this. And that was the area of specialty for my PhD research, is what kind of information is required to encode proteins, and what does that information do in terms of three-dimensional structure of proteins. But it must, on average, be increasing. You can go up and down like this, but the trend must be upwards. The reality is that the genetic information encoded in the DNA of all life forms is deteriorating throughout all of life, from bacteria, humans, the fruit fly, and everything that we've been able to examine on a long term, we're witnessing the deterioration of the genetic information. And that occurs through mutations, mutational loading, and gene loss. And natural selection will remove the worst, the ones that cannot reproduce. But the problem is that if you, let's say for humans, the pregnancy rate stays relatively the same, but the miscarriage rate is increasing, and it is at a shocking rate. It's increasing so fast, I don't want to tell you the number here because I got to dive into this deeper, but it was shocking what the miscarriage rate is now per every 10 years within humanity. But one thing I will, reference number 8, note that here. One thing, I will come back to that when I talk to the fall. There is a very disconcerting paper published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science that predicts that within 200 years, the human genome will have deteriorated so badly we will be in serious trouble as far as the survival of Homo sapien. That's Proceedings of the National Academy of Science, unless we start employing genetic engineering and selective breeding. So you'll have to have a license to reproduce, and that'll be, but of course they're saying that's unethical, we can't do that, but we all know where things happen sometimes. But this is not good enough. What I've done here is I've just said, okay, this is what Genesis, God says he did, but what about the positive evidence that he did that? Now science, and remember we saw a deterioration of genetic information here. So where did this information come from? And this is where we begin to see the fingerprints of a mind. Now right now, science has only one, and I circled one, observable, testable, and repeatable method for creating significant levels of functional information, and that is intelligent minds. You read that over, memorize it. As much as you'll see creative stories being told in the literature, when it comes to actually testing these things, science has only one observable, repeatable, and testable method of producing significant amounts of useful information, and that's intelligent minds. That's the only option science has right now, and it's looking, because of the nature of information, it's looking like that ever will be. Now, the DNA of even the simplest life form carries an enormous level of information, digitally encoded in its DNA. Indirectly, that's one of the reasons why Eugene Koonin said what he did. Just the information to start RNA replication is impossible in his mind to ever occur in the history of this universe, so he needs an infinite number of them. Therefore, and this is in the form of a logical argument here, therefore the only verifiable, repeatable method that science has to explain the origin of that information is an enormously intelligent mind. And I say this on university campuses, and I know there's going to be a reaction, but I also know they got nothing else. They got nothing when it comes to repeatable and testable methods of producing information. It's true. There's just no way out of this. Let's look at the great fall and decay of nature. God created the universe and stated it was very good. And when God says it's very good, probably flawless and perfect. But after Adam performed his experiment to see what would happen, the state of the entire universe instantly collapsed to a state of bondage to corruption. And we could talk about quantum mechanics and the collapse of wave function and how that instantly will change the state of the cosmos. But we won't. It's just it's a fascinating rabbit trail. But the bottom line is that something has gone terribly wrong with creation. And what we actually observe, what science indicates to us, is that, yes, the whole universe is undergoing decay. The stars are slowly running out of fuel. It was interesting in my engineering textbook on thermodynamics, there was one ending sentence in one of the chapters on how entropy actually increases all the time. And it says, this suggests that there may have been possibly some mechanism at the origin of the universe to start off with zero entropy. And it actually said there might have been a creator, but I think that's the only time I said that in the whole thermodynamics. That was my engineering textbook at the University of Manitoba. Okay, when you observe the time between Adam's fall and the flood, and that depends on whether you're looking at the Masoretic or Septuagint text, God says that all life had corrupted its way. How does all life, all flesh, corrupt its way? Well, here's the verse. All flesh had corrupted their way on the earth, and God said to Noah, I've determined to make an end of all flesh, for the earth is filled with violence through them. Not just humans. How do you corrupt life? Well, what science has done now is tell us exactly how you can corrupt life, and that is corrupt the information that builds those life forms. And it's steadily undergoing that corruption. But there may have been a very rapid, almost a vertical asymptote at first that now tends to level out over time. A rapid change in all of life. That's another area to go down that rabbit hole, but of course time. Mutations are steadily and relentlessly increasing and destroying all of biological life, from bacteria to fruit flies to humans. And in that reference, I gave you some references to peer-reviewed journal articles on this issue. But here's the one for humans. Proceeding as National Academy of Sciences says that each generation of humans, this is a general knowledge that we have, that we accumulate 50 to 100 mutations. But over the next few centuries, according to the findings of this paper, a substantial reduction in human fitness can be expected, to the point where it jeopardizes our future. We may go into extinction just from natural processes of deterioration of the genetic information. Of course, they have some proposals there with a little unethical, but part 4. I want to look at the issue of infallibility now. Do you believe that you are infallible in your interpretation of Genesis chapter 1 to chapter 2, verse 4? Because I see this all the time. Most Christians would never say, I am infallible in my understanding of Scripture, but when it comes to this passage, they will say so. So what I want to do here is just point out a few things in the text. I've pointed out a few things already to say, well, maybe your faith in science is a little, you better be careful there. And now I want to say maybe your confidence in your own interpretation. There are some things right in the text here. So, first question is Genesis chapter 1 being told to us from God's perspective or ours? And to be infallible and dogmatic, you have to answer that question yes or no. I see signs in there, some pretty strong wording in there, that it's actually being given to us from God's perspective. So first of all, the unusual way to describe a day. The Jews measured a day from sunset to sunset. But then there's a case for the Sabbath. It was from evening of the Friday, evening to evening on the Saturday. But during creation, it's described differently. There was an evening and there was morning, a second day. Literally, it describes a nighttime. But it could also represent an endpoint for the events just mentioned for that day. A couple of other no definite articles in front of the day numbers. So it's not the first day, the second day. It might say that in your English translation. But there are other translations just say a first day or day 1, day 2. That's a very unusual way. In fact, later on in Numbers 28, where they're talking about 8 feast days, there was always a the, or the Hebrew word is the letter hey, in front of each number to say this is the first, the second. That's absent in Genesis chapter 1, except for the last day. So the translating it as the first day is an interpretive addition of the definite article the. Now that doesn't entail anything about how long creation took. My objective here is just be cautious when you see things like this, that about implying that, I'm infallible. So, but what really throws a monkey wrench into it is that it's summed up. The 6 days of creation are summed up, and it ends in chapter 2, verse 4. And keep in mind the chapter divisions were put in later. They were not the inspired word of God. They were put in later. So this creation account actually appears to end with verse 4 of chapter 2, and then it goes into a bunch of details that weren't covered in the first overall creation account. But in that Verse 4, it says, this is the account of the heavens and the earth. He's wrapping up, he's summarizing here. When they were created in the day that the Lord God made earth and heaven, same word, Hebrew word, yom, but it's singular. So he just said it was 6 days, and this entire 6 days is summed up in one day. It was one day of creation. It was the creation day, so to speak. So it states that the entire time, and this is a logical contradiction, if we're measuring time as humans do, which is a substance which actually elapses, and so you have consecutive events here. So what's the solution here? It doesn't necessarily, you got to be cautious on this. It doesn't immediately leap to an old Earth or a young Earth. In fact, old universe would be more of a way to put it. Old universe, young universe, whatever. But we measure time by how much of it elapses. God clearly states that he does not measure time that way. And he gives this one day is, you're all familiar with this, as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is one day. What he's saying here, he does not measure time as we do. So what other way is there to measure time? In physics and in philosophy and in even theology, there is another way to measure time, and that's in terms of events, clusters of events, and a nested hierarchy of events. So physics nowadays, I think the majority of physicists recognize maybe we should be measuring time in terms of events and clusters of events. So, and we observe that God does it sometimes this way. He measures time in terms of events and clusters of events. For example, there's the hour of trial that is coming on the whole world. And you might say, well, that's just figurative. Well, maybe not if he's talking about measuring a cluster of events and putting a time denotation on this. Or what about the year of the Lord's favor? It's a lot more than just 1 year. What about the day of the Lord? That's mentioned 24 times. Now, this is particularly interesting. It struck me that if God is measuring time in terms of events and clusters of events and a nested hierarchy, what struck me is that he begins the Bible, possibly in Genesis chapter 1, using that way to measure time until Adam is created, then the normal time. And he ends the Bible in the book of Revelation with talking about the day of the Lord, which we know occurs from Thessalonians chapter 1, first letter, with being caught up to meet the Lord in the air at the last trumpet. Thessalonians chapter 2 reiterates that with regard to the return of the Lord and our gathering together, it will not occur, to the effect that the day of the Lord has come, it will not occur until, and then give some criteria here. So just to wrap it up here, this isn't the way it is. I'm not saying this is the way it is. I'm saying be careful on how confident you are in your interpretation, because if God is measuring time here in terms of clusters of events, it's exactly the kind of language you would use with no definite articles in front of the name, where all the 6 piles of events are on a table and you're saying, this first pile here is this and that, and then we come to a second pile and you would use as you went, and then the last pile. So there you see it. Possible way of doing that. That's a nested hierarchy that makes sense of how he sums it up. This is the kind of creation on the day when he did it, singular. So the day represents the large green thing, the creation day, and it's composed of 6 subcomponents. That actually could be 6 nanoseconds. It could be 6 24-hour periods. It could be 6 trillion years. It could be 6, so it does not entail how long it was, and you have to decide what you're going to do with this to be honest with the text. The human approach to time, though, I would say, starts with the creation of Adam, because it tells us how old Adam was when Seth was born, and so on forth. And so he's clearly using time in the sense that we normally use it. It's not that clear in chapter 1. My own suspicion, okay, I'll tell you what my own suspicion is in all this, because I'm just stirring the pot a little bit. But it's summed up by an atheist guy I debated twice. We liked each other. We had a good time. He'd take me out for dinner once or twice, and went to his house for tea sometimes. Michael Roos, he died just a couple of years ago. And he told me after lunch one day, he's a hardcore atheist, refused to, but he says, you know, the more science advances, the more I have no idea what's going on. And it's because of some of the things like dark matter, dark energy, the fingerprints of what appears to be intelligence in the genome. And I just laughed. Now, he put it in more colorful language, mind you. I've toned it down here. The more I have no idea what was going on is not a literal thing that he said. But I appreciated his honesty. He said to me one day, Kirk, what do you think of old people who get towards the end of their career and they suddenly change their mind on everything they've stood for? And I think, please let that happen. And I tried to share the gospel when in his final days, and he was not receptive. I feel terrible. I just feel sorry. I grieve for him. My own suspicion personally is that the creator of the universe is at the wedding of Cana, and he was making a point when he turned the water into wine. He was making a point. So I don't feel particularly constrained to make the scriptures fit the narratives at hand when the narratives at hand has such huge problems with them, and there seems to be emerging evidence for the fingerprints of a designer in the back. Summary thought, this is my last slide. Logic requires a supernatural creator for nature. Science has revealed the fingerprints of an intelligent creator, but be cautious about assuming infallibility in two things. Be cautious about assuming science is infallible in its own narratives and creative stories about the past, and be cautious about your assumption of infallibility when you look at Genesis chapter 1, given what we observe in the text. Could mean maybe what you think it means, but it might not. And there it is. You can just take that with your cell phone, get the download, or if you prefer to write it down, there's the link.